Snow didn't just fall. It knew where to strike. It slipped through cracks, buried your breath, slowed your blood. In such conditions, only those who turned their homes into weapons survived. Winter in a medieval village wasn't a season. It was a sentence, one that could only be delayed. And for ordinary peasants, the primary line of defense was the house itself. But don't be misled. These were not hastily built huts. Every part of the structure was born from centuries of survival, trial, and terrible error. A house wasn't simply built. It was shaped to outlast death. Peasant homes in 12th to 14th century Europe were often dug 1 or 2 feet into the earth. This wasn't some romantic notion of underground coziness. It was a way to escape the wind. The surrounding soil retained heat and held a steady temperature, creating a buffer between bones and frost. The house burrowed into the ground like a creature into its den, and that's what saved lives. Windows were tiny, more like the eye sockets of a skull. There was barely enough light, but what mattered more was keeping in the warmth. Fewer openings meant fewer leaks. Ceilings were low, not just because people were shorter back then. They kept warm air closer to the body. Every decision served one purpose: don't freeze. The walls themselves were made from wattle and daub, thin branches woven like a basket, coated with a mixture of clay, straw, and manure. It may sound like a joke, but the ancients knew better. This blend insulated against the cold and regulated moisture. The smell was familiar, but the warmth was essential. Modern reconstructions have shown these walls retained heat as well as today's cheap insulation. The hearth was the heart of the house. Not in a corner, not against a wall, but at the center, so it could warm everything at once. A pot of stew hung above it, people gathered around it. Rumors were born there, decisions made. The hearth wasn't just a stone bowl, it was the final stronghold. Around it they slept, ate, and healed. And when the embers died, the strongest would rise to light them again, because without it, warmth was the first to die. Roofs were thatched not from poverty, but strategy. When laid at the right angle, straw shed snow and blocked the cold. It could last for years as long as it was protected by smoke. Smoke wasn't fully vented, it was trapped inside. It clung to the ceiling, filled the cracks, repelled insects, and killed mold. The price? Watery eyes and rasping breath. But the walls lived longer. And so did the people. Homes were prepared for winter like living beings. Cracks were sealed with fresh clay and straw. Skins and coarse fabrics were hung on the walls, not for decoration, but as extra insulation. These were the tapestries of the poor, heavy and practical. Roofs were rethatched, fresh straw layered over the old. Every hand in the village knew its task. A single mistake in the repairs could cost not just warmth, but breath itself. Even the direction of the house mattered. The front faced south to soak in as much sunlight as possible. The roof's angle was calculated to shed snow without losing its cover. These weren't pathetic hovels. They were carefully crafted thermal machines, built without formulas, shaped by experience alone. But all of this was just the shell. Beyond the door was the real battle. Outside, the wind tearing at the roof. Inside, breath turning to frost. They survived because the house breathed with them. They lived inside it like inside a shell. But when the winter came stronger than usual, not even the strongest walls could save them. They prayed for spring to come. But what came was worse than winter. When darkness lasted nearly the entire day, time stopped being just a matter of clock hands. It became a weapon, one you could wield, or one that could destroy you. The winter sun in a medieval village appeared briefly, like a guest who'd forgotten why they came. Villages froze in half-light, and under those conditions, peasants couldn't afford the luxury of disorder. Their days were scheduled with the precision you'd now only find in military regulations. Not because they loved order, but because any deviation could mean death. Forget the usual idea of rising with the sun and sleeping with its setting. In winter, peasants slept in 2 phases. The first began at nightfall and lasted until the middle of the night. Then came a waking period. The second sleep followed, lasting until dawn. This was known as first sleep and second sleep. In between, they did what hadn't been done during the day. Checked on animals, mended clothing, spoke quietly, prayed. Some even visited neighbors. The night wasn't lifeless. It breathed in murmurs and half-sleep. Morning didn't begin with work. It began with a check. Had anyone frozen during the night? The most vulnerable were children and the elderly, and those first few minutes after waking were filled with tension. Only after that came the slow, almost ritual process of warming up, stoking the hearth, reheating stew, checking the livestock. The most important time of day was midday, when the sun reached its highest point. In those brief hours, the village came alive. All major outdoor work happened then. Sheep were sheared, firewood chopped, visits made. Everything depended on the day's warmest temperatures. Court records show that in some villages, people were fined for not showing up to work at high sun. One peasant, according to documents, had to give up a rooster for absence during peak daylight. To keep the village from freezing, every family took part in fire watches, night shifts tending the communal flames. In cold seasons, fires in places like forges and baking ovens couldn't be allowed to die out. Each family had its night. Refusing or forgetting meant punishment, usually in kind. Eggs, a chicken, a bundle of firewood. Sometimes it meant several days of unpaid labor. Chronicles mention a case where an entire family was ordered to carry water to neighbors' ovens after their fire went out the night before a frost. To enforce discipline, signal systems were used. Cold sentinels monitored water freezing in clay bowls. If the temperature dropped below the danger point, a horn was sounded, a call for everyone to return home. It wasn't just a sound. It was a survival signal. After midday, life moved indoors. Villages literally contracted. Each person entered their home and closed the world behind them. Work continued, but now it was with clothing, tools, food. In the larger homes, evening gatherings took place, not from cheer, but because dozens of bodies could warm a space better than the most determined hearth. These were twilight councils, where they discussed matters, rumors, faith, and death. Even going to bed followed a system. The last family to put out their fire went house to house to check that hearths had been safely extinguished. This was law. Improper extinguishing caused fires. A peasant mentioned in the records who slept through his duty had to surrender half his winter firewood supply. Their time did not belong to them. It belonged to the cold, and every hour had to be used, not for productivity, but for survival. They lived by a rhythm colder than steel and more precise than any mechanism. But even they couldn't foresee that one day, even that wouldn't be enough. They kept watch over the fire, but one night, the dark lasted longer than their shift. There was no scent of spices, no hot pies or hearty dinners. There was only one task: make the food stay warm longer than the fire. Food in a winter village wasn't about flavor, it was about survival. Every meal wasn't a pleasure, it was a tactical move, because if the body didn't warm up from within, no blanket or straw could save it. At the heart of the kitchen was the stew, but not like today's quick-cooked soup experiments. This was something entirely different. The stew pot sat on the fire not for an hour, not even a day. It wasn't taken off the hearth for weeks. Every time someone grew hungry, more was added. Another root vegetable, a handful of grain, a chunk of salted meat, some beans. It simmered endlessly, growing thicker, stronger, more potent. It wasn't just a meal. It was a living thing. It breathed, just like the village itself. This stew didn't just feed, it warmed from the inside. Dense, nourishing, it was designed to help the body retain heat longer. Its foundation was root vegetables, beets, turnips, parsnips. Then came beans and lentils, protein that didn't spoil. On top of that, grain scraps, a quick source of energy. Layer by layer, it was more of a nutritional strategy than a recipe. Some villages even had strict rules about the order in which ingredients were added. It was a food code. But nothing lasted forever. Sometimes the stew went sour, sometimes mold won. Sometimes the clay pot cracked from temperature swings. Then it had to be started all over again, on an empty stomach, in freezing silence. Drinking water in winter was nearly suicidal. Nearly every stream, puddle, or barrel was contaminated. So they drank what they knew how to brew, weak, cloudy, but safe. They drank ale. Even children. Especially children. This wasn't a celebration. It was a guarantee you'd still be breathing in the morning. Fermentation killed bacteria, a lesson paid for in generations. The ovens used for baking bread doubled as heaters for homes. When the great village oven cooled, its warmth lingered in the clay walls. And people ate together to warm each other with their bodies and the steam rising from their bowls. The food itself often didn't look like food. Salted fish, dried meat, pickled vegetables, everything dark, dense, pungent. It didn't bring joy, but it kept you alive. Sometimes they cut pieces straight from frozen fat reserves, thawing them near the fire. It wasn't mealtime. It was a break from the cold. In especially harsh years, they ate roots of wild plants, bark, moss, dried grass. They'd mix it with flour and bake flatbreads that resembled stones more than bread. These weren't chewed. They were soaked in hot water. The elders said the taste was bitter, but better than the taste of death. And still, there were rules. Even in the chaos of survival, they existed. Children ate first. Elders sat closest to the fire. The sick were given more fat. Everyone knew, because a mistake in the kitchen could mean sickness in the barn, or a funeral on the doorstep. Cooking in winter wasn't about food. It was about warmth, about sharing, about knowledge carved into bodies that had collapsed from the cold. And every spoonful of stew, every sip of thick ale, that was a step further from the frost. One more day, one more night. When ice covered the fields and the last roots vanished from the garden, the real test began. Winter asked its question harshly. Had you managed to preserve what the year had given you? It wasn't enough to grow food. You had to know how to hold on to it when the earth froze, water turned to stone, and air became a blade. Medieval peasants understood. Food was time, and the longer you could delay its disappearance, the greater your chance of survival. They built underground pits, dark, damp, cold. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were storage chambers calculated by the laws of survival. Every layer was placed with intent. First straw, then root vegetables, more straw on top, followed by snow. The entrance was plugged with hay. No air got in, no light came through. Inside was a steady chill that kept the food from rotting or freezing. These were refrigerators, built from earth and experience. Different vegetables were stored in different parts of the pit. Carrots went where it was slightly warmer, turnips deeper, rutabagas near the walls, where they could breathe. They had no thermometers, but they had carrots. If they cracked, it meant it was too cold. If they went limp, it was time to open the vents. They read their roots like books. Some villages built snowbanks around their storage pits. Snow wasn't cleared. It was used as insulation. As long as it stayed, the food remained safe. In especially good years, food from these pits lasted until spring, sometimes longer, sometimes too long. The entire system was based on rotation. Supplies were never left still. They were moved from pit to pit depending on the weather. It was like a chess match against nature, and every move could cost you a month of life. Forget where you stored something and you could lose everything. That's why each family had their own maps, not on paper, but in their minds. Memory was the most important tool. To make sure food was still safe, each village had an appointed fool. Not foolish in mind, but in duty. They sampled the food, raw vegetables, old grains, leftover stew. If they got sick, the food was discarded. It was one of the most hated roles. Some pretended to be ill just to avoid it. One peasant even claimed he died from bad turnips and disappeared for 2 days. They found him asleep in a barn. They laughed, but he lost his role. The diet changed with the cold. Food became fattier, denser. People ate lard, bone grease, leftover meat, grain cakes. anything that could warm the body from the inside. Healers of the time said, to avoid freezing, eat twice as much as in summer. It wasn't indulgence. It was survival science. If the body didn't get enough fuel, it began to cool, and a person faded like a forgotten torch. Villages followed food clocks. The heaviest meal came in the morning to generate warmth, the second during the day's peak, and the third, lightest one, just before sleep. This wasn't comfort. It was a system. Break it, and you'd wake up with pain in your chest, with cold under your skin. Or you wouldn't wake up at all. They didn't eat for pleasure. They ate because they knew. Each bite extended the heat. Every slice of bread, every spoonful of stew, every sip of broth was one more step away from the cold. But there was one problem no one could predict. Fire could go out. Food could run out. But without clothing, neither would save you. The body became a target for the cold, and fabric, a shield, but only if made right. In popular images of the Middle Ages, clothing often looks like ragged fabric thrown on at random. But in reality, a peasant's winter clothing was almost an engineering project. Not about fashion, not about wealth, about survival. The foundation was wool, not washed, not purified, still full of lanolin, the natural grease that made it repel water and snow. Washing it meant destroying its protection. So winter clothing wasn't cleaned. It wasn't filth. It was strategy. Wool soaked with sweat, smoke, and fat kept out moisture better than any imported fabric. But wool alone wasn't enough. Layer by layer, peasants dressed themselves with intent. The inner layer, soft, thin, often spun from yarn or mixed with nettle fibers, wicked away moisture. The middle layer, slightly denser, held in warmth. The outer layer, coarse, thick, sometimes rubbed with grease or resin, blocked wind, snow, and rain. Some villages made clothing stuffed with moss and straw, woven between layers of wool. It was an old method. Moss not only retained heat, but also prevented fungal growth. There were even moss gatherers, people who knew where to find the warmest, driest, toughest moss. Disputes broke out between villages over the best gathering spots. Sometimes fists were involved. Winter garments were treated with fat. Sheep tallow, pig fat, even deer grease was rubbed into the fabric, forming a water-repellent coating. Add pine resin, and the effect was dramatically stronger. They didn't know formulas, but they knew the proportions. Their recipes were passed down like family heirlooms. Hoods weren't just sacks with holes. They were shaped to block crosswinds, snow, and biting dampness. Some had multiple panels that could be shifted like shutters to control airflow. Even shoes, though simple in appearance, were carefully designed to retain warmth. Pointed toes reduced contact with frozen ground. Inside, peasants stuffed straw, moss, and old cloth. Primitive, yes, but effective insulation. Every piece of clothing served a purpose. 3-fingered gloves allowed tool use without sacrificing heat. Belts cinched tight at the waist kept warmth from rising and escaping. Fabric was stitched at specific angles to reduce heat loss during movement. Clothing was made collectively. Women, children, and elders gathered in homes turned into spinning workshops. These wool evenings weren't festive. They were strategy. Dozens might gather in one room, and the heat of their bodies alone could raise the temperature without any fire. It saved firewood. More importantly, it created the warmth of clothing, in the most literal sense. Timing mattered too. In some places, there were signs. When birds flew south, when grass turned black, when the sun dipped below the horizon earlier than usual, it was time to bring out winter clothes. This wasn't superstition, it was observation, because if you waited too long, you might not make it. These people didn't wear fashion. They wore knowledge. Every stitch, every patch, every fold had meaning. Their clothes could be rough, itchy, heavy, but they saved lives. They allowed movement. They kept death at bay. But even the thickest cloth couldn't hide the crackling in their bones. When wind scratched at the walls and frost formed on the iron hooks in the corner, sleep became a danger. But if you lay down the right way, the body turned into a furnace, and the night became a chance. Sleep in winter wasn't rest. It was strategy. To sleep meant to retain warmth. Get your position wrong, and you'd freeze. Break the order, and you risked waking death, hidden in the morning cold. Sleeping spaces weren't soft beds. They were wooden platforms, slightly raised above the ground. Below them, air, which prevented the earth's chill from stealing the body's heat. Sometimes straw was stored underneath. In the cleverest homes, they kept small animals there. The heat would rise from beneath, turning the platform into a true barrier against the cold. Entire families slept on these beds, elders to infants. 6, 7, even 8 bodies packed tightly together. Not out of love, but necessity. That was how heat stayed in. That was how cold stayed out. People lay down like spoons in a stack, side by side, chest to back. The most vulnerable were placed in the center. Children, the sick, the women. At the edges, adults, ready to rise if there was noise or need. Body position mattered. People didn't sleep stretched out. They slept half-seated, backs to the wall, knees bent. This reduced the surface exposed to cold and allowed the body to warm itself more efficiently. Modern scientists later confirmed this posture actually conserves heat. But peasants didn't need studies. They knew it through generations of survival. There were few blankets. Instead, they used hides, old clothes, moss, sacks stuffed with straw. Sometimes, cloth was hung over the sleepers like a canopy to trap the warmth of their breath. On the harshest nights, people were even covered in warm ash from the hearth. It wasn't comfortable, but it was warm. The order wasn't just in placement, it was in rhythm. Those who got up, for a watch or bodily need, returned to the outer edge. The rest shifted. The center of the bed, the warmest spot, always stayed filled. Positions rotated like a dance without music, half asleep, driven by instinct. But this was monitored. In some villages, there were assigned night watchers, elderly or women who stayed awake until the end of the night. They checked to make sure no one remained at the edge too long, that no one drifted off, that no child's shoulder was left uncovered. Their duties were simple but vital. Preserve the body's warmth, preserve the family's warmth. Breaking the order was considered a serious offense. Records show families being fined for sleeping too loosely. One village elder wrote that children were lying apart, and this was seen as a threat to communal welfare. They were ordered to sleep properly and received less firewood the following week. Everything was connected. Even the bed itself wasn't simple. It was built with a slight slope, barely noticeable, so bodies would slide toward the center, where it was warmest. Sometimes the sides were raised, creating a sort of bowl. It wasn't comfortable, but it saved lives. The bedding was chosen wisely. Straw first, then fabric, then wool, layered. Some families changed straw every season to prevent lice and rot. At night, they placed heated stones in sacks by the feet, or bowls of hot water. Anything to stretch the warmth just a little longer. And still, there were nights when even that wasn't enough. When wind pierced the walls, when breath turned to frost, when even 6 pressed-together bodies couldn't share enough heat. Then they all awoke at once. Then more wood was thrown into the fire. Then they prayed for dawn to come early. There were no radiators in the rooms. And when the walls began to breathe cold, it was time to call those who warmed in silence. Their wool held heat. Their breath held the night. A peasant's house in winter wasn't just shelter for the family. It was a refuge for animals, too. Not out of pity, but necessity. Because body heat wasn't a luxury. It was currency. And every source of that heat had its own price, its place, its purpose. Large livestock were kept close to the sleeping platforms. Cows breathed slowly, heavily, like living furnaces. Their vapor rose upward, creating a warm cloud beneath the low ceiling. Their bodies gave off heat that lingered for hours. The thicker the cow, the better a family's chances of surviving the night. Pigs, warmer than they seemed, were placed near the walls, close to food storage. They didn't just warm the room, they helped preserve the food. Chickens were smaller, but they had their role. They nested in alcoves, under shelves, in baskets near the hearth. Their warmth was enough to keep the water in pitchers from freezing. Placement wasn't random. It was calculated. Every family had a plan. Where the cow would stand, where the pig would lie, where the chickens would settle. Everything was measured. In some villages, disputes even broke out over who got to keep the largest bull if space was limited. People took it to the elders. They wrote formal petitions, because the biggest bull could mean the difference between a warm night and a frozen one. There were even heat appraisers, older men who assessed how much warmth each animal provided. They weighed the livestock, examined them, listened to their breath. Their word was final. Did a family have enough living fire for the winter? If not, they were advised to combine households with neighbors. Sometimes, they were relocated to communal dwellings. The animals changed the air itself. It became warmer, more humid. Bad for the lungs, but it saved the walls from cracking, the air from drying, the wood from breaking. Centuries later, scientists confirmed it. Such humidity levels helped preserve wooden structures, but peasants knew it by feel. If the boards didn't creak, it meant the house was breathing right. Even manure had its role. It wasn't thrown out right away. It was layered. Straw, ash, manure. This formed a living bedding. As it decomposed, it released heat. No smell, if arranged properly. And it warmed. Not much, but steadily. It wasn't discarded. It was absorbed. In winter, every drop of warmth was worth gold. Feeding the animals was done with precision to avoid heat loss. Through hatches, cracks, tiny doors, so main doors wouldn't be opened, so warm air wouldn't escape. Some even built rotating feed boxes, loaded from outside, turned inside. People knew every door opened was a life lost. There were rules, too. How many animals could be kept indoors, how much heat they had to provide. Who was allowed to keep bulls, who, goats, all written in village scrolls, because disorder among animals meant disorder in heat. And disorder in heat meant death. But there were winters when even the animals couldn't keep up, when their breath wasn't enough, when even 3 cows couldn't warm the floor. Then came the relocations. Families merged. People joined people. Animals were brought to the center. Homes formed rings. Like a hive. Like a living organism contracting to survive. One person could stay warm, but they couldn't save a house. A village didn't survive by nature's mercy. It survived by its own rules. A medieval village in winter wasn't just a cluster of homes. It was a machine, and every cog in it knew its place. Because without a shared plan, heat escaped, the fire went out, and no one could hear you knocking on the wall. Preparation for winter began long before the first frost. While the sun still hung high, every village already knew who would chop wood, who would gather moss, who would patch the roofs. Families were divided into groups. Some cut trees, others stacked, others hauled. Each group worked by schedule, in shifts. They rotated to avoid exhaustion and breakdown. One mistake wasn't just a poor result. It meant a cold room and a frozen child. There was a system for keeping track. How much firewood you gathered, how much you helped a neighbor, how often you attended meetings, not on paper, but on sticks, with notches, and in the elder's memory. Everything was recorded, and if you didn't contribute, you weren't invited into the common house, or you got the coldest spot. The common house, or council hall, wasn't just a place for talking. It was a reserve hearth. Families whose homes couldn't cope moved there. Twilight councils were held, discussing who was falling ill, who was running out of hay, who needed help. But this wasn't charity, it was calculation. One person freezing was a threat to all. One burned-down home meant less heat for the yard. Everything was connected. Even the meetings had structure. They gathered at sunset, so the shared warmth of bodies would raise the room temperature. Sometimes they brought in stones heated in the oven and placed them in the center. Sometimes they boiled herbs not for drinking, but so the steam would lift the humidity. They knew. Even conversation could become a weapon against cold. Breaking the order had consequences. Official ones. Miss your shift. Give up part of your wood. Oversleep your turn at the hearth. Carry water for the whole yard. Forget to extinguish your fire. Work without rest for the next week. Not out of anger, but necessity. Because survival had no tolerance for laziness. There were elders, too. They were called by different names. Winter keepers, watchers, fire guardians. They didn't command. They guided. They ensured nothing was wasted, that feed was enough, that no one forgot. Winter hadn't left yet. Some walked from house to house in the dawn stillness, listening. Is the family breathing? Is the fire burning? Is the roof cracking? Even the fires had rules. Who brought kindling first? Who left last? Who watched the children near the flame? Everyone knew. Everyone remembered. Because disorder in one corner became disaster in another. But the strictest system was for mutual aid. If someone lost their home, neighbors were required to take them in. If livestock died, others gave one of their own. Refusal was rare, not out of kindness, but fear. Because when one falls, winter grows stronger. And if the village breaks from within, then the cold doesn't wait. One family stopped bringing firewood, and the whole village learned what darkness without heat really meant. When frost kills the roots and the ash in the hearth fades to gray, taste becomes the last thing that reminds you you're still alive. Even in the dead of winter, people weren't just searching for food. They were looking for comfort, spoken in the language of the tongue. Winter food wasn't just about what was stored. It was about what could survive in the earth when the sky itself seemed to crack with cold. Medieval peasants knew these plants. Their names are nearly forgotten now, but once they held entire villages on the edge of starvation. Skirret. White, slender, sweeter than carrot. It grew downward, not outward. It stayed alive underground while everything above withered. It didn't need to be harvested early. It was dug up as needed, even from beneath the snow. It didn't fear frost, and its taste, warm, slightly sweet, reminded people of summer. It was stewed, roasted, boiled into broths. Some even made sweet cakes from it, even in the harshest months. Good King Henry. A royal name, but a peasant's fate. It grew wild, needed no care, and returned every year, even if forgotten. In spring, its leaves saved people from scurvy. In winter, its roots became rough, but nourishing bread. It was used when cabbage vanished, when the last heads rotted, when even salted turnips stirred no appetite. Bitter, sharp, but real. They called it all's well, because it saved lives. Salsify, a root that tasted like oyster. Soft, slippery, slightly salty. It was grown specifically for winter fasting, when meat was forbidden and fish was scarce. It was boiled in milk, roasted in ash, mashed into porridge. It lasted for months in the cellar, never rotting, never darkening. And when everything else was gone, it remained. Medlar, a fruit that couldn't be eaten fresh. It had to rot, to ripen through decay. It was laid on straw and left to wait. Weeks, sometimes longer. Only then did it become a soft, dark pulp, sweet like stewed apple, with a shadow of spice. Its taste was a reminder that even decay could offer salvation. They made pies, jams, mead from it. But most of all, they kept it. Its taste was rare. It was eaten in silence. Fat hen, a plant modern people call a weed. Back then, it was a lifeline. Its leaves were picked and dried for flour. Its seeds were ground down. It was added to flatbreads when the wheat ran out. It grew everywhere, even beneath snow, even on trash heaps. It was a gift no one asked for, but everyone accepted. Simple, resilient, necessary. And there was scorzonera. Always dark, always tough, like the root of night itself. It couldn't be eaten raw. It had to be cleaned slowly, patiently. but it kept longer than anything else. It was planted for one reason only, to be the last hope. For February, each of these plants wasn't just food. It was memory, a reminder that winter hadn't taken everything, that even earth sealed in ice could still give something living. These flavors were simple, sometimes unpleasant, but they warmed something deeper than the body, something that whispered, "Spring will come." When spring finally came, it didn't bring relief. It brought the bill, and the cold that tormented bodies left scars on the soul. Winter didn't just test people, it changed them. Those who made it through were never quite the same. Their steps grew quieter, their eyes more watchful, their hands rougher. Spring didn't bring joy, it brought release, and with it, grief. In the first warm days, the inventory began. Who survived? Who didn't? What remained? Doors were opened to houses where no smoke had risen in weeks. Hearths were checked, bodies were searched for, sometimes only bones, sometimes just an empty bed taken by despair. The forest that once held firewood now held footprints of escape. Winter didn't only take people, it took teeth, joints, sight. Those who survived were left with aches that never truly left. They called it the ice within. The body would warm, but something inside never thawed. From that, myths were born. Stories of creatures that came at night and sucked out the heat, of shadows that lived in smoke, of cold as punishment, of the sky's revenge for someone's pride. These weren't fantasies. They were attempts to explain why some died and others didn't, why one morning arrived and another didn't. The wisdom of survivors became law. Those who once saved a house from fire, who knew the rhythm of the fire by heart, who could tell from the sound of hooves how much livestock remained. These people were honored, listened to, placed at the front during gatherings, not for their knowledge, but for experience, etched in their wrinkles. Villages that followed rules, that worked together, survived more often. Villages where discord arose, where someone tried to outsmart the winter, disappeared. Not overnight, but eventually. The ruins of such places are still found by archaeologists. Burned walls, flooded cellars, traces of panic. Even they are silent reminders that cold does not forgive pride. Winter taught something simple. Warmth isn't just firewood. It's order. It's discipline. It's the belief that the second night will come, that someone will wake, feed the fire, hold you, check on you. Without that, even a stove can't keep you warm. Today, winter is a celebration. Candles, lights, songs. Back then, it was an exam. Every year, with no retakes. And the survivors didn't tell stories. They just looked at the sky, held a bowl of warm stew, and said nothing. Because they knew, spring is not a gift. Spring is the price you pay for everything you gave. They survived. But with what part of themselves did they pay for the spring? If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.